Canada sends 77% of its exports to one country. Not 77% to its top 5 trading partners combined, 77% to a single country, across a single border, through a single relationship. For 30 years, that was a strategy. Then that country imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum, tariffs on Canadian cars and car parts. It called Canada's Prime Minister the governor of the 51st state, and it threatened to use economic force to make Canada part of the United States. Mark Carney won the Canadian election on April 28, 2026, by saying, "Trump is trying to break us so he can own us." Here is what happens when you trust one customer with everything. 77% to one country. Then that country turned. This is what the Canada versus Australia episode predicted, and what Canada is now living through. The Canada versus Australia episode on this channel argued that Canada's decision to deepen its U.S. trade relationship rather than diversify toward Asia was the single decision that explained the growing gap between Canadian and Australian prosperity. That episode asked a hypothetical question: what happens if the U.S. relationship fails? This episode answers it. The U.S.-Canada trade war of 2025-2026 has reduced Canadian GDP by 1.5 to 2%, cut steel exports 55%, auto parts exports 24%, and cost the average Canadian household $1,700 to $2,000 per year in higher prices. Canada is now under extreme duress, doing in 12 months what the previous episode argued it should have done over 40 years. Whether that emergency diversification can succeed, and whether Canada can fundamentally change its economic orientation, is the question this episode answers. Chapter 1: The Relationship That Built Canada. The Canada-U.S. economic relationship is the largest bilateral trade relationship in the history of the world. In 2024, total Canada-U.S. trade in goods and services was approximately $700 billion annually. The two countries share the world's longest undefended border, 8,891 kilometers. They share a language, a legal tradition, and 200 years of peaceful coexistence. The relationship is genuinely remarkable. It is also, from Canada's perspective, a relationship of profound structural vulnerability. Canada sends 77% of its merchandise exports to the United States. That figure represents approximately 25% of Canadian GDP. $1 in every 4 that Canada earns comes from selling things to one country. No other advanced economy is remotely as concentrated in a single export destination. The UK sends about 14% of its exports to the US. Germany sends about 9%. Australia sends about 4%. How did this happen? NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement signed in 1994, accelerated a deepening that had already been underway since the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement of 1988. The logic was compelling. A country of 40 million people sitting next to the world's largest consumer market, with no tariff barriers between them, should naturally orient its production toward that market. Canadian factories were designed to serve American customers. Canadian supply chains were integrated with American ones. Decades of investment decisions were made on the assumption that the U.S. market would always be accessible on preferential terms. The Canada versus Australia episode asked whether this made sense given the long-run trajectory. The events of 2025-2026 have answered the question with unusual clarity. Before I describe what happened, I want to be precise about what the previous episode argued and what this one is testing. The argument was not that the U.S. relationship is bad. It is a remarkable relationship that has delivered enormous prosperity to Canada. The argument was, what is the cost of having no alternative? This episode shows that cost in real time. Chapter 2: What the Tariffs Actually Did. The U.S. tariffs on Canada began in early 2025 and escalated through the year. The most impactful were the sector-specific tariffs that remained after various legal challenges and trade negotiations. Steel. Canadian steel exports to the United States fell 55% year over year from their 2024 levels. The steel industry, which employs tens of thousands of Canadians in Ontario and Quebec, faced the sharpest single-year contraction in its post-war history. Stelco, Dofasco, and Algoma, the three major Canadian steel producers, all announced capacity reductions and layoffs. Aluminum. Exports fell 12%. Canada is the world's fourth largest aluminum producer and the United States' single largest supplier. The tariffs made Canadian aluminum uncompetitive in the U.S. market for the first time in decades. Automotive. Canadian auto parts exports to the U.S. fell 24%. The integrated North American automotive supply chain, in which a car crosses the border an average of 7 times during manufacture, became a cost nightmare overnight. Stellantis and Ford both temporarily suspended operations in Canadian plants. General Motors cited the tariffs as a $3 to $4 billion risk factor in its 2026 financial guidance. The macroeconomic impact. Economists estimate the tariff cycle has reduced Canadian GDP by 1.5 to 2%. The average Canadian household is absorbing $1,700 to $2,000 in higher annual costs. The Canadian dollar fell. Business investment fell. Consumer confidence fell. The Canadian economy entered a state of what economists called stagnation, not quite recession, but growing far below potential. Chapter 3. Canada's Emergency Diversification. The response from Canadian businesses and government was faster than most analysts expected. Within 6 months of the tariffs' imposition, Canadian firms had recovered approximately $11 billion of the $18.5 billion in lost U.S. trade through new export markets. The primary beneficiaries were European countries, which bought Canadian goods that had previously flowed to the U.S. The diversification was real, but it also revealed just how hard genuine diversification is when you have spent 30 years optimizing for one customer. The factories, the supply chains, the logistics infrastructure, the contractual relationships, all of it was designed for the U.S. market. Pivoting to Europe or Asia means building new relationships from scratch, learning new regulatory requirements, shipping across oceans rather than over land borders, and accepting lower margins while new relationships are established. The data told a careful story. Canadian goods exports to the U.S. were down 10.4% year-on-year by early 2026, but exports to other countries were up 42.4%, though much of this was driven by elevated gold exports to overseas markets rather than the structural diversification of manufactured goods. Strip out gold, and the picture was less impressive. Canada's share of exports going to the U.S. fell from 77% in 2024 to approximately 66% by February 2026. A genuine shift, but from a position of extraordinary vulnerability. The Canadian government response was to create new fiscal support structures. The Large Enterprise Tariff Loan Facility extended to large businesses struggling to access liquidity. A 6-month pause on retaliatory tariffs for goods used in Canadian manufacturing and food production, and accelerated negotiation of trade agreements with the EU, India, and Indo-Pacific partners. The scale of the response was significant. Its long-run effectiveness will not be known for years. Chapter 4. Carney, the Election, and What Comes Next. The political response to the trade war was, in one respect, clarifying. Mark Carney fought the April 28, 2026 Canadian federal election almost entirely on the question of how to respond to American pressure. He won a minority government. His victory speech contained the sentence that defined the political moment. Trump is trying to break us so he can own us. And what we know, above all else, is that Canada will never, ever be part of the United States. Carney came to the prime ministership with a specific economic biography. Former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, an economist who had spent decades thinking about how economies manage external shocks. His policy platform was built on three pillars. First, negotiate with the United States from a position of strength, not weakness. Decline to make concessions under threat that would have been reasonable under normal conditions. Second, aggressively diversify trade toward Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and the Global South. Third, reduce internal trade barriers between Canadian provinces, a long-standing inefficiency that became newly urgent when external trade was disrupted. The CUSMA USMCA review, already scheduled for 2026, became the central economic negotiation of Carney's government. The outcome of that review, whether it produces a new agreement that stabilizes the trade relationship or fails to do so, will determine Canada's economic trajectory for the next decade more than any other single factor. Chapter 5. Canada versus Australia, the test result. The Canada versus Australia episode made a prediction that Canada's U.S. dependency was a structural vulnerability that would eventually be tested. The test arrived in 2025. Here is what the comparison shows now. Australia diversified its trade over 40 years. Canada is attempting to diversify its trade over 40 months, under duress, without the institutional infrastructure that a long-run diversification requires, and while its primary export market is simultaneously reducing its appetite for Canadian goods. The pace of emergency diversification is real and faster than expected. But emergency diversification has higher costs, lower margins, and worse quality than planned diversification. Canada is paying the price for doing in months what it should have done over decades. The specific comparison that matters is the 2020 test. The previous episode noted that Australia faced a similar test in 2020 when China imposed $20 billion in trade sanctions. Australia's response? It found alternative markets for most of the affected goods within 18 months. The reason it could do this? It had 19 other major trading partners with established relationships to absorb the displaced trade. Canada in 2025 is attempting to do what Australia did in 2020, but starting from a position where 77% of its trade flows to one partner, rather than Australia's 30% to China. The arithmetic is unforgiving. If you send 77% of your exports to one customer and that customer reduces purchases by 15%, you have lost 11.6% of your total exports overnight. If you send 30% to one customer and that customer reduces purchases by 15%, you have lost 4.5%. The buffer of diversification is not just nice to have, it is the difference between a manageable disruption and a macroeconomic shock.
Chapter 6. Can Canada change in time? The optimistic case for Canada is this. The crisis is accelerating decisions that should have been made long ago. Alberta's separatist frustration is pushing the federal government to address internal trade barriers. The trade diversification that took Australia 40 years is happening in Canada in 40 months. Mark Carney brings genuine economic credibility to a moment that requires it. The USMCA review may produce a more stable framework, and Canada still has extraordinary structural advantages: a resource-rich economy, an educated workforce, rule of law institutions, and a geographic position that makes it the natural land bridge between the Atlantic and Pacific economies of the world. The pessimistic case is this: 30 years of infrastructure designed for one customer cannot be redirected in 40 months. Canadian factories, pipelines, railways, and ports are oriented south. Reorienting them east or west requires capital investment at a scale that has not yet been committed. The short-run diversification, Canadian businesses finding European buyers for steel and grain, is not the same as the long-run structural shift that would reduce the U.S. share of Canada's export basket from 66% to something resembling Australia's 4%. That shift would take a generation. The historical parallel the previous episode drew was this. Australia in 1983 was where Canada was in 2024, highly dependent on existing markets, resistant to the structural reforms needed to diversify, and vulnerable to an external shock that hadn't yet arrived. The difference is that Australia's shock arrived slowly, through the gradual decline of British Commonwealth trade preferences, and gave Australia time to adjust. Canada's shock arrived overnight, through a single administration's decision to use tariffs as a geopolitical weapon. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. Canada is now being forced to make the pivot that the previous episode argued it should have made voluntarily. The question is whether being forced to do it under economic duress produces the same long-run result as choosing to do it from a position of strength. Australia chose from strength. Canada is being forced from weakness. That difference matters. Mark Carney said, "Trump is trying to break us so he can own us." What he did not say, but what the data shows, is that the vulnerability that allowed the breaking to be attempted was 30 years in the making. The 77% dependency did not appear overnight. It was built, agreement by agreement, factory by factory, decade by decade. The lesson of Canada is not that the U.S. is a bad partner. It is that having no alternative to any partner, however reliable that partner may seem, is not a strategy. It is a bet. And in 2025, the bet was called. This is Macro Atlas. Thank you for watching.